Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on one of the most compelling questions, I think, in global economics. It's really quite frustrating for a lot of people. How did China and the broader economies operating under its powerful cultural influence, like the Four Dragons, achieve such explosive, sustained economic transformation? Especially when, for decades, its own foundational philosophy, Confucianism, was literally blamed for making it backward.
It really is a fascinating issue. It forces us to try and reconcile, rapid capitalism with these ancient traditions. So today we're diving into a detailed academic reexamination from the mid-90s. It looks at Chinese cultural values, or CCVs, and compares them directly against the attributes that Western researchers typically use to define successful entrepreneurship.
Right. And the mission here is really to get past the easy cultural cliches, isn't it? To find the actual links, the undeniable conflicts, and maybe most importantly, the big gaps between these two worlds that seem, on the surface at least, pretty incompatible.
Exactly. And the source material is great because it catches this debate right at a key moment around 1995. That's just as China's economic reforms were really starting to show huge results.
Okay, so let's start with the paradox that kind of sets the whole stage. You mentioned it earlier. Over a century ago, back in 1905, Max Weber looked at Confucianism and basically said, this is the problem.
He argued it fostered a passive, order-focused society that just couldn't handle the dynamism needed for capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Weber and many others after him really saw Confucianism as the reason for China's, well, its structural inertia. It was painted as the historical villain.
Hmm.
But now, fast forward to the time of the study, and it's either being rehabilitated or, at the very least, tolerated as maybe a foundational piece of East Asian success.
So this deep dive is going to explore whether those cultural values themselves actually support that economic success.
Yeah.
And I suspect the answer isn't going to be a simple yes or no. Not at all. As you'll see, the findings suggest the relationship between tradition and entrepreneurship is really complex. It's often contradictory, and probably much more of a hybrid system than people often assume.
Okay, let's unpack this cultural bedrock then. Starting with that historical turnaround you mentioned. It's hard to overstate, isn't it? If you were a reformist, a radical intellectual, or certainly a communist in China for most of the 20th century, you actively rejected Confucianism. It represented the old feudal order, the stagnation they wanted to overcome.
Absolutely. That rejection was intense. It was institutionalized, especially, as you might expect, during the Cultural Revolution. But as the source material points out, the huge shift towards market economics and the growth they saw in the 15 years leading up to 95, well, that created a powerful reason to reconsider these traditional values.
Ah, so success breeds acceptance, or at least tolerance.
Something like that. Confucianism started being brought back into the mainstream, not necessarily as a political system, mind you, more as the sort of foundational identity of the Chinese people, especially as private enterprise started to reemerge and needed perhaps some cultural grounding. And it's important to remember when we talk about modern Chinese culture, it's not just Confucianism floating in a vacuum, right? The sources are clear. It's actually a mix of three big, sometimes colliding elements. That's right. First, you have the traditional culture. Confucianism is dominant there. But you also have Taoism, Buddhism, various regional cultures playing a role. Second, there are the decades of communist orthodoxy, which obviously shaped institutions and public life profoundly. And third, you have the more recently adopted Western values, things related to commerce, maybe individualism creeping in.
But Confucianism remains the bedrock, the main traditional influence.
It seems so. It still acts as the primary blueprint, you could say, for Chinese interpersonal behavior. Fundamentally, it's a behavioral and moral doctrine. It comes from Confucius's teachings about ethical behavior, social structure, work ethics. It's not just suggesting things. It provides pretty strict rules for almost every human interaction.
Let's get into those rules. The five constant virtues sound like a good starting point. What are they?
Okay, these are the sort of ethical anchors for the ideal Confucian person. They are humanity, or ren, righteousness, yi, propriety, li, wisdom, zi, and faithfulness, xin. But the real mechanism for social order, the thing that really structures society, lies in the relationships.
Ah, the five basic human relationships, the Wulin.
Exactly. These define the structure of society. They aim to ensure harmony by setting up these strict hierarchical pairings, defining exactly what each person owes the other. Let's list them out. 1. Sovereign and subject. That's about loyalty from the subject and duty or responsibility from the sovereign.
Okay.
2. Father and son, governed by love or perhaps care from the father and absolute obedience from the son. Absolute obedience. That's strong.
It is. 3, husband and wife. Structured by obligation from the husband and, traditionally, submission from the wife. 4. Elder brother and younger brother. Defined by seniority, the elder sets the example, the younger follows and respects that. And finally, 5. Friend and friend. This is the only non-hierarchical one, supposedly based on mutual trust.
What really jumps out there is the rigidity, as you said. These aren't suggestions, they're fixed roles. The goal seems to be achieving optimum benefits by keeping society harmonious and, frankly, static.
And this whole structure really rests on two core concepts, Li and Zhen.
Right. Let's define those. Li first.
Li is crucial. It's the institutional mechanism, you could say. It refers to propriety, correct conduct, the rules of behavior. Li is what shapes those interpersonal relationships into those clear hierarchical pairings we just discussed. Individuals are expected, strongly expected, to behave strictly according to their role within these relationships, and absolutely not seek to change that role.
So it's the cultural mandate for maintaining the status quo. Keep everything in its place. Precisely. It's designed for order above all else.
Okay, and if Li is the mechanism, what's Zhen?
Gen is maybe the core moral drive behind it all. It translates roughly as humanity, benevolence, goodness. It's about unselfishness, the ability to sort of gauge other people's feelings by understanding your own. Empathy, perhaps, within that structured context.
And the emphasis on Zhen, combined with the structure of the Wulun, that's what marks Chinese society as fundamentally collectivist.
Absolutely. It contrasts sharply with the individualism you see emphasized in many Western societies. And notice, as you pointed out earlier, 3 of those 5 relationships, father-son, husband-wife, elder-younger brother, are family-based. This really confirms the paramount importance of the family unit. Loyalty often flows upwards through the family, sometimes even superseding loyalty to the state or abstract laws.
And that deep-rooted family structure, plus the sovereign-subject hierarchy, does that explain the paternalistic management style often seen in East Asia?
It certainly contributes heavily. We see it historically, not just in China, but across Japan and Korea too. In a business context, the manager often acts like a father figure, or maybe a master to a follower. There's an expectation of care and responsibility from the top, yes, but in return, there's a very strong expectation of loyalty, deference, and obedience from below.
It's a system built for stability, clear command chains. But you can already see how that might clash with entrepreneurial needs, like quick decisions, flat structures, maybe initiative coming from lower down.
Exactly, that's the tension. The very rules of conduct, the LIA, seem designed to stifle what we might call creative disruption in the West.
Okay, so we've got the philosophical background. Now we need to look at the specific values that were actually tested in this study. Defining cultural values is always tricky, isn't it? Culture is fluid, subjective. The researchers started with a benchmark, right? The Chinese Culture Connections 1987 survey, which had 40 values.
That's right, the CCC survey was the starting point. But the really core insight of the paper we're looking at is that those 40 values, while a decent start, were actually incomplete. They did a huge review of literature, specifically on Chinese culture and management, trying to get a more indigenous perspective, you could say. And this led to a massive, and I think really significant, revision of that list.
How significant are we talking? Give us the numbers.
Well, they increased the total list by nearly half, 47.5% to be precise. It went from 40 values up to a much bigger list of 59 total values.
Wow, okay, so that means 20 completely new values were added, because they felt these were just as important in defining how Chinese people behave, especially in business, but they were missing from the original list.
Exactly. And the original list might have had perhaps a bit of a Western bias in its selection. These additions try to correct that. So nearly half the foundation we're using for comparison is actually new to this specific study. And the additions are really crucial for understanding the potential conflicts or synergies.
Let's talk about some of those additions, because they really highlight the potential disconnect between Western and Chinese cultural measurements, don't they?
They really do. One critical addition was bearing hardship. This speaks to incredible resilience, patience, often framed as sacrificing now for a much bigger long-term goal. Very important culturally.
What else?
Another one, governing by leaders instead of by law. This is huge. It emphasizes relying on the personal virtue, the authority, the reputation of the leader, rather than relying on abstract, transparent legal systems that apply equally to everyone. Think about the implications for business contracts or risk management.
Definitely. And values reinforcing the hierarchy.
Yes, they added deference to age and deference to authority, which basically doubles down on that Wulun structure we talked about, maintaining the order.
Wow.
But perhaps the most important addition from modern business, certainly one that gets talked about a lot, is Guamsi.
Guanxi, personal connections, relationship networks, it seems so central to doing business in China. It's amazing it wasn't in the original 40.
It is quite surprising looking back. Unlike Western transactional networking, Guangxi implies this deep, long-term, reciprocal, almost moral obligation. It often trumps written contracts. It's a form of social capital, really, built on profound trust, sometimes over generations.
What other notable additions were there?
Things like attaching importance to long-lasting relationships, not short-term gains, which reinforces that long-term orientation. They also explicitly added fatalism, the idea of believing in one's own fate. That's a direct challenge to the Western entrepreneurial idea of forging your own destiny, isn't it?
Absolutely. Taking control versus accepting fate. Big difference.
And let's not forget one they added that creates an immediate conflict with typical Western business goals, not guided by profit. This really highlights that Confucian inheritance, where the scholar was elevated and the merchant was looked down upon. Seeking profit was seen as, well, morally dubious.
That's a powerful cultural anchor right there. Now, you mentioned they added 20, but the list went from 40 to 59, so one must have been deleted.
Yes, exactly. One value was removed, solidarity with others.
Interesting. Why remove that one? Seems like a positive value.
The authors argued that while it might be an ideal, it often wasn't reflected in practice, especially on a larger national scale. They even referenced a common saying that the Chinese are like sand, they cannot be held together. Quote. It suggests that while loyalty within tight circles, family, clan, Guangxi networks is incredibly intense, that very intensity can sometimes hinder broader national solidarity or collective action.
Okay, so we end up with this list of 59 values. The study then groups them into 7 categories: national trait, interpersonal relations, work attitude, and so on. Seems a bit arbitrary, but okay. But even with this more comprehensive list, you're saying we need to be aware of internal contradictions within the culture itself.
Absolutely. Culture isn't neat, right? It's complex, it's living. And this list reflects that. You see a value like adaptability, CCV 37 listed, but then you also see being conservative, CCV 45. How do those coexist? And as we just mentioned, not guided by profit, CCV 39, seems to clash directly with having wealth, CCV 43, listed as a desirable outcome elsewhere.
So there's a tension there between the traditional ideal and maybe modern aspirations or realities.
Exactly. And we also have to stress, this list aims to capture a broad sort of mainstream traditional culture. The authors acknowledge it overlooks significant differences. Think about the values of a peasant farmer versus a university intellectual, or regional variations across China. That's a big caveat. Also, some values pushed during the communist era, like aggressively conquering nature, aren't listed here, suggesting this list leans more towards a revived traditional ideal, maybe like harmony with nature.
So this list of 59 gives us a clearer, albeit complex and sometimes contradictory baseline. It represents the core, persistent foundational norms, and it sets us up perfectly to see how this traditional culture stacks up against the dynamic, risk-taking behavior we associate with Western entrepreneurship.
Right. So to do this comparison properly, we need a clear target. And Section 3 of the study tackles defining entrepreneurship from a Western perspective.
Yeah.
And the first point they make is that finding one single universal definition of entrepreneurship is notoriously difficult. Researchers still debate it.
Yeah, I can see that. Does it mean starting any small business? Or does it have to be innovative or high growth? It's fuzzy.
Exactly. It covers everything from, a local shop owner to a tech billionaire disrupting a whole industry. But while the concept itself is hard to pin down, the study argues it's actually easier to identify a set of consistent attributes or characteristics that most successful entrepreneurs tend to share, at least in the West. And these attributes serve as our benchmark for the comparison.
Okay, so which Western frameworks did they use for these attributes?
They drew on several well-established ones, people like Hornaday, Timmons and his colleagues, Gibb, and also Gartner. These are pretty much the gold standard in North American and European research on what makes entrepreneurs tick.
Now, an obvious question might be, why use Western attributes to study a Chinese context? Isn't that potentially imposing an external model?
That's a fair point, and the authors address it. They justify it based on a 1992 study by Ray and Wong. Ray and Wong replicated some of Gartner's research in Asia and actually found a fair bit of consistency with North American and European samples regarding core entrepreneurial behaviors. So while the authors fully acknowledge that Chinese entrepreneurs might have unique cultural attributes like the importance of guanxi, which isn't really on the Western list, they argue the core characteristics identified in the West were consistent enough to use as a valid starting benchmark.
Okay, that makes sense. Use it as a baseline. But keep in mind there might be unique local factors too. Do these different Western frameworks focus on the same things? Hornaday, Timmons, Gibb, Gartner?
Not entirely, and that's important. Hornaday, Timmons, and Give tend to focus more on the psychological traits and behaviors of the individual entrepreneur. Things like personal drive, commitment, persistence, risk tolerance, the sort of who they are aspects.
Right. Personality and behavior. What about Gartner?
Gartner's work is interesting because it shifts the focus slightly. He
Hmm.
did a big Delphi survey, starting with loads of definitions and ending up with about 90 attributes.
Hmm.
And his highest rated attributes, the ones experts agreed, were most central, focused much more on the action of creating a business, not just the personality traits.
The action, like what specifically?
Things like the creation of a new business entity, very concrete,
Right.
or integrating opportunities with resources to create a product or service, or bringing resources together to act on a perceived opportunity. It's about the doing the active disruption, innovation, and resource management needed to launch something new.
So it's a more outward-looking, action-oriented definition compared to the others, which are more about internal traits?
You could say that, yes.
Yeah.
Gartner emphasizes the venture creation process itself.
Okay, so we have our two sides clearly defined now. On one side, 59 Chinese cultural values heavily focused on maintaining order, personal cultivation, relationships, hierarchy. And on the other, a set of Western entrepreneurial attributes focused on initiative, integrating resources, taking risks, and actively creating new businesses. The potential for contrast seems pretty stark just setting them up like that.
Exactly. Now we get to the core comparison. This is where the study really digs in and moves beyond just theory to look at the actual data on compatibility. Let's start with the hits, the areas where the CCVs and the Western EAs actually align. This shows that traditional values aren't totally irrelevant to market success.
Right, there must be some overlap. And you mentioned these hits mostly come from the frameworks focused on personal traits, Timmons, Hornaday.
That's correct. The biggest overlaps seem to revolve around things like self-discipline, hard work, and persistence.
Okay, let's get specific. What aligned with the Timmons framework?
Timmons' framework found common ground with 7 CCVs. These include things like total commitment, determination, and perseverance, that's CCV 31. Also persistence, which is CCV 34. And critically, the moral foundation of integrity and reliability, CCV 48. These are sort of the bedrock survival virtues for any long-term endeavor, business included. They also found alignment on emotional stability, CCV 53,
Hmm.
and high intelligence and conceptual ability, CCV 51.
Okay, so commitment, persistence, integrity, stability, intelligence. Makes sense. What about Hornaday?
Hornaday's list reinforces this. 4 common traits were identified. Perseverance again, CCV 33. Diligence, CCV 31, same idea as commitment to hard work. Resourcefulness, linked to CCV 51. Intelligence, conceptual ability. And significantly, ability to get along with people, CCV 12.
Ah, that last one connects directly to the CCV emphasis on harmony and interpersonal relations we discussed. Managing relationships is key.
Exactly. And Gibbs' framework adds 3 more common values. Moderate risk-taking, CCV 40. It's moderate. Hard work again, CCV 31. And leadership, CCV 30.
So, if you're listening, the key takeaway here seems to be that traditional Chinese culture does provide a strong foundation for certain aspects of business. Things like working incredibly hard, being patient and persistent, acting with integrity, building strong networks. These are clearly supported by the CCVs.
Absolutely. These elements are definitely conducive to long-term business survival and maybe steady growth. They
Hmm.
provide a certain kind of stability and ethical grounding.
And this feels like a big but. Here comes the central finding of this whole deep dive, doesn't it? The piece of data that really makes you stop and think. When the researchers compared the 59 CCVs to Gartner's classification, the one focused on the act of creating a business, the innovation, the resource integration, there was no commonality at all.
0. Not a single overlap. That absence is profound. It really throws the fundamental difference in cultural priorities into sharp relief. Remember, Gartner's top attributes are about creation, integration, disruption, launching something new. The Chinese cultural values overwhelmingly are concerned with interpersonal relations, hierarchy, personal cultivation, basically, how to fit into and maintain the existing social structure.
It really feels like a clash between maintaining virtue within the system versus creating new value that might disrupt the system. Okay, so no overlap with Gardner. Now let's explicitly look at the attributes that are in direct opposition, the conflicts. The first one is something we flagged earlier, profit orientation.
Yes. Hornaday lists profit orientation as a key EA. I
Mhm.
mean, it's pretty fundamental to Western capitalism, right? But the CCV list includes value 39, not guided by profit. This isn't just a minor difference. It's a deep-seated cultural value. inherited from Confucianism's disdain for commerce. The ideal person pursues moral standing, scholarship, governing, not grubbing for money.
A fundamental conflict. What's the second major conflict point?
It relates to individual agency, to control over one's life. Gives list of EAs emphasizes a high belief in control of one's own life. That internal locus of control, the idea that I make my own destiny, which seems essential for someone willing to risk everything on a new venture.
But the Chinese list.
The Chinese list contains CCV 57. Fatalism, believing in one's own fate. If you genuinely believe your success or failure is largely predetermined by destiny or cosmic forces, rather than your own aggressive actions, well, that culturally dampens the drive for relentless striving and risk-taking, doesn't it? Why push so hard if the outcome is already written?
It undermines the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea. Okay, conflict 3.
This one deals with action itself, specifically change and initiative. The CCVs clash with Hornaday's positive response to change. Remember lay a lot, and the focus on maintaining order. Change is often seen as disruptive, not positive. And they also conflict with the fundamental attribute of initiative, which is cited by Hornaday, Timmons, and Gibb as crucial for entrepreneurs.
Taking the first step, seeing an opportunity, and acting on it without being told.
Exactly. In a culture defined by Lee and the pursuit of social harmony, stepping outside your assigned role, taking aggressive initiative, especially if it disrupts the market or the established order, that can easily be viewed as a threat to stability. It could be seen as selfish, even culturally defiant, rather than virtuous.
Okay, so we have hits, persistence, hard work, integrity. We have direct conflicts, profit, control of destiny, initiative, response to change. But maybe the most striking finding is what's simply missing altogether.
That's arguably the most profound gap identified in the study. The attributes that come up again and again in virtually every Western model of entrepreneurship, the absolute pillars of innovation and market dynamism, namely creativity, innovation, and flexibility.
They're just not there.
They are completely absent from the entire list of 59 core Chinese cultural values. They simply aren't part of the traditional cultural vocabulary when defining virtue or ideal behavior. The traditional system didn't value them, didn't foster them. In fact, as we've discussed, it often actively discouraged them because innovation is inherently disruptive, and flexibility potentially undermines the stability of the hierarchy.
Wow, okay. That leaves us with a serious paradox to unpack.
It really does, because on one hand, you have academic work, maybe most famously Hofstede and Bond back in 1988, that found this strong link between what they call Confucian dynamism and economic growth. The high performers in Asia, the four dragons, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, plus Japan, they all scored really high on this Confucian dynamism index.
Right, I remember that. The idea was that the Confucian ethic, maybe like the Protestant work ethic in the West, encouraged things like high savings rates, investment in education, long-term planning, all things that clearly help economic development.
Exactly. It looked like the cultural values were driving success, but when this study drills down into the specific traditional values that actually make up that system, we find they're often actively opposed to the very engines of modern entrepreneurial success: creativity, initiative, profit-seeking, flexibility.
So how do we square that circle? How can the cultural system that seems to correlate with success simultaneously reject the key attributes like innovation that we think are necessary for that success?
I think the answer lies in understanding the original purpose and context of Confucianism. It was developed as the value system for a huge, centralized, feudal agrarian empire. Its number one goal, its existential focus, was maintaining harmony and order across a vast and potentially fractious population. From that perspective, things like individual initiative, radical creativity, disruptive innovation, these aren't assets, they are threats. They introduce uncertainty and challenge the established order.
So in a society structured for maximum stability, that desire for order naturally leads to a more passive role for most people.
Generally, yes. The social structure, the Wu Lun, dictates that only the person at the very top, the ruler, the master, the father, has the legitimate authority to take decisive action. And even their authority is theoretically bound by heaven's mandate, by moral conduct. Everyone else's role is primarily to adhere to Li, stay in their designated place, maintain harmony, and essentially do as they are told.
It's a system where individual behavior is meticulously scripted by rule.
And where stability is the highest virtue. In that context, the kind of individual agency that drives entrepreneurial risk-taking and market disruption is naturally discouraged. It looks selfish, destabilizing, maybe even immoral from a traditional standpoint.
You can really see this conflict embodied in the ideal figure in Confucianism, the scholar bureaucrat, compared to the entrepreneur.
Absolutely. The ideal was the scholar who studied the classics, cultivated virtue, and aimed to govern the state wisely and morally. Personal financial gain was seen as beneath them, even corrupting.
And this wasn't just an ideal, it was baked into the social structure, wasn't it? The low status of merchants.
Deeply baked in. Traditional Chinese society systematically belittled commercial activities. The merchant, the businessman, was placed on the absolute bottom rung of the social hierarchy, ranked below scholars, peasants, artisans, even soldiers sometimes. To be involved in commerce was seen as lacking true moral standing in the traditional Confucian view.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this. The conclusion seems to be that traditional Confucian values, when you look closely at them, are fundamentally not supportive of many key Western entrepreneurial attributes, especially innovation, creativity, initiative, profit focus. But they're not irrelevant either. They provide something else.
Exactly, they aren't irrelevant at all. They seem to provide the organizational or social capital, the values that do align well, strong emphasis on guanxi, the focus on interpersonal harmony, getting along with people, the incredible persistence and diligence, the integrity, the long-term orientation. These are absolutely vital. They help explain the structure and resilience, for instance, of many overseas Chinese family businesses. They create trust within networks, foster stability, encourage long-term thinking.
So they explain how business gets done, the relationships, the endurance, even if they don't explain the initial spark of disruptive innovation itself.
That seems to be a good way to put it. The successful modern Chinese entrepreneur, therefore, might be operating in a kind of hybrid space.
Okay.
They're likely leveraging the traditional strengths, the power of guanxi, the cultural capacity for hard work and persistence, while simultaneously needing to acquire or express those attributes like creativity and proactive initiative that the traditional culture perhaps didn't value or provide on its own. Hashtag Habane Chantra.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. The central finding of this deep dive seems to be a warning against easy answers, right? Cultural explanations for economic success are really attractive. They offer a neat story. Oh, they succeeded because of their unique values.
No.
But when you rigorously test those specific traditional Chinese values against Western benchmarks for entrepreneurship, you find that many CCVs are actually against the very attributes Western models prize most highly, like initiative, creativity, and maybe even profit motivation.
That's the core takeaway. It forces us to question simple cultural determinism. Culture is obviously a huge factor, but it's not the only factor driving economic outcomes. And the source material itself provides a powerful reminder of this, a kind of historical control group. Think about it. When the four dragons, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, were taking off economically in the 60s and 70s, benefiting from this supposed Confucian dynamism, mainland China, which shared the exact same deep Confucian cultural roots, was simultaneously trapped in the chaos and darkness of the Cultural Revolution and economically near bankruptcy.
Wow, yeah. Same cultural foundation, radically different political and economic systems, leading to completely opposite outcomes.
Exactly. It powerfully demonstrates that culture provides the background, the social fabric, maybe the interpersonal operating system. But the actual engine of entrepreneurial growth seems to require other things too. Enabling institutions, economic freedoms, maybe a shift in mindset towards embracing risk and innovation, things that had to be introduced or allowed to flourish separately from just the traditional values.
So that brings us to the ultimate conclusion from this study, doesn't it? To really understand modern Chinese entrepreneurship, you need a holistic view. You can't just isolate Confucianism and say that's the answer. You have to look at the entire complex, sometimes messy cultural system as it exists now. That includes the legacy of Confucianism, yes, but also the impact of communist ideology and pragmatism, the deep importance of family obligation, and the very aggressive absorption of Western technology, market ideas, and maybe even some Western values.
Precisely. It's a dynamic mix. And the knowledge we've gained from this comparison strongly suggests something else too. That the attributes and values we use to define a successful entrepreneur in the West often developed in capitalist, largely individualistic, maybe historically Christian-influenced cultures, might not have universal application. Our standard Western frameworks, maybe based on Silicon Valley or Wall Street ideals, might be fundamentally missing key elements of what makes someone successful in Shanghai or Shenzhen.
Which leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given that Chinese entrepreneurship is succeeding, often spectacularly, despite these apparent conflicts with traditional values, What unique attributes may be cultivated out of necessity or leveraged differently from tradition might actually define the truly successful Chinese entrepreneur today. Think specifically about things we've discussed. The profound operational importance of Guangxi, maybe seeing it not just as networking, but as a form of essential business capital. Or consider the extreme long-term orientation fostered by values like bearing hardship. Are these unique cultural strengths perhaps compensating for a perceived lack of traditional emphasis on, say, creativity and individual initiative? Or are they helping to form an entirely new, context specific model of entrepreneurial success, one that our standard Western frameworks simply fail to capture or even recognize?
That question and how we answer it is probably vital for understanding the future shape of global commerce and innovation. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.